A-Peeps? Welcome to your first set of notes. We are jumping into our very first unit of AP Psych, and I'm super excited if you can't tell. So this first unit is going to focus on the history and approaches of psychology and psychology as a science. So today we're just going to be focusing on the history of psychology and how did it develop. So you will notice as you get your textbook and start looking at the textbook, it is divided into small sections within each chapter called modules. It's different from our modules on Canvas, so that might be a little confusing, but basically that's just breaking it down into smaller topics. So this first module, we're going to look at the roots of psychology and how it developed as a science. And before we get into the specifics, here are some of the key topics we're going to cover in this set of notes. And I want you to think about this quote we have here. And this is from a famous psychologist named Carl Jung, not Jung, Jung, like a Y. And it says, "For it all depends on how we look at things, and not on how they are themselves." In other words, when you're looking at psychology, we're studying why people think and act the way that they do, not necessarily looking at why are things the way that they are. We're looking at why are people the way that they are, and that focuses on the mind and behavior. So, as we go through this set of notes, I want you to think about this essential question. How has the field of psychology been influenced by other disciplines? And also, how has it changed on its own as a field over time? But before we get into all of that, we need to define this word. The word psychology comes from the Greek words psyche, which means mind, and logia, which means the study of. Now, you probably knew that second part, but the first part, that's what psyche means. And so essentially we're studying the mind, but more than that, we're studying the mind and behavior, because oftentimes our behavior can be informed by what's going on up here. So we are going to be looking at the scientific study of human thought and human and animal behavior. Now, another definition that I want to go over with you before we move forward is empiricism. And this is important because psychology is a science. Now, hold up. I know some of you, you just had a heart attack because you were like, wait a second, I thought I was taking a social studies class, not a science class. The good news is that this is a social science, so you are partially correct. And there is no bad news, because even if you are not a great science student, like I didn't feel like a strong science student in high school, you can do it, because if I can do it, you can do it. So my social studies pros that aren't necessarily science fanatics, don't panic. My science peeps, yay, you are in a place where you're like, yes, I have this, I got this. All right, so as a science, as scientists, we are going to be studying this in a scientific manner. So when we talk about empiricism, we're talking about relying on evidence that we gather very carefully through different methods. And that's going to be later. Another set of notes will talk about the specifics of what research methods psychologists use. But basically, it's collecting data in a very careful, systematic way, in a scientific way. So psychology is a science. Now, let's get to the history. All my social study peeps, back to the history, okay? Psychology as a science was born in December of 1879, and it starts in the lab of this guy right here, Wilhelm Wundt. Wilhelm Wundt, yes, it sounds like a V because it's German. Okay, so Wilhelm Wundt, I like to call him Papa Psych. Okay, Papa Psych because he is the father of psychology. It was born in his lab at the University of Leipzig in Germany in 1879. And this was the first psychology lab in history. And early psychologists like Wilhelm Wundt and a few others focused on using introspection to study what was going on in the minds of people. Introspection is just like looking inwardly. So when someone asks you, how does that make you feel? That's kind of introspection. The problem with introspection, the reason why we don't just use that nowadays, and the reason that we use it less, is that when I ask you, how does that make you feel, or why do you think that is, your answer is going to be very subjective. There's no way you can detach your feelings from that answer, so it cannot be objective. Well, as scientists, we want to be objective. So we moved away from that as the field developed. Two other really important early psychologists are Edward Titchener and William James. Both of these guys started two of the earliest what we call approaches or schools or perspectives of psychology. So the first is Edward Titchener. He started the branch of psychology that was called structuralism. Structuralism is like it sounds. They focus on the structure of the mind and the consciousness. So what that means is they try to break it down into its components, into the pieces that make up the whole, not looking at the whole all the time. So that's why I have a puzzle piece here on my slide, because that's what I think of. I think of a puzzle, and I think of it being broken down by each piece and looking at it one piece at a time and not necessarily zooming out to the whole picture. Then you have William James, who was heavily influenced by the ideas of Charles Darwin. And as you might know, hopefully you know, Charles Darwin was the scientist that proposed the theory of evolution. And so evolution focuses on survival of the fittest, adaptation. So functionalism is the perspective that William James bases off of Darwin's ideas. And just like Darwin, it focuses on adapting. So a functionalist is going to look at how mental and behavioral processes function, how do they work to help us to adapt to the world around us. So how do they help us survive? How do they help us adapt? How do they help us flourish? And I have a little picture here of two gears, and I'd like to think of them working together. So how does it work? That's what that makes me think of. And William James is also known for being the author of the very first psychology textbook, which is called Principles of Psychology. All right, so now let's take a minute to just compare these two perspectives. So we've got structuralism was based on Wundt's European perspective. It was established by Edward Titchener, and it sought to identify what the mind and consciousness were. On the flip side, functionalism was based on the ideas of William James, who was influenced by Charles Darwin. It is focusing on the practical applications of psychology in everyday life, and it seeks to identify how the mind and consciousness work. So if you have to remember, and this is a great thing for you to practice as you're memorizing this vocabulary, what's the difference between structuralism and functionalism? The main difference is structuralism focuses on what the mind and consciousness are. Functionalism focuses on how they work. I will go quickly through this slide. This is just extra. William James was a very interesting guy. Here are some funny quotes from him. He has some interesting quotes. But one of the cool things about him, too, is that in a time where there was still great gender inequality, he mentored Mary Whiton Calkins, another famous psychologist, who became the first female president of APA, which is the American Psychological Association. So good job, William James. Way to support your ladies. Speaking of the ladies, here are some famous female psychologists from early psychological history. First is Mary Whiton Calkins, like I just said. She was William James's student. She was the first female president of the APA, and she founded one of the first psychology labs at Wellesley College. Then you have Margaret Floy Washburn, who was the first female to receive a PhD in psychology. She wrote a book called The Animal Mind, so she studied the minds of animals, not just humans. And she's the second female president of the APA, so she succeeds Mary Whiton Calkins. And one psychologist that you may have heard of before in your U.S. history class is Dorothy Dix. Dorothy Dix is very well known because she worked very hard to fight for the protection of lower class people who were put into mental hospitals. So she investigated the living conditions of poor people who had mental illnesses. And that led to the building of some of the first mental asylums in the United States to support those populations. All right, bringing it back to some of the guys. We've got G. Stanley Hall, who was the first ever president of the APA. And he also founded the first journal for research in psychology. He created the first United States Psychology Lab at Johns Hopkins University as well. And then another very well-known and very important psychologist is Max Wertheimer, another German name. He is well known for establishing what is called Gestalt psychology. And Gestalt psychology, Gestalt is a German word that means shape or form. And so in Gestalt psychology, we look at the whole picture, not the parts. So it's like the opposite of structuralists. A structuralist looks at one puzzle piece at a time. A Gestalt psychologist looks at the entire picture. So if you're looking at this picture with me, think about this question. What would a structuralist see, and what would a Gestalt psychologist see? So a structuralist would probably say they see flowers, right? Because they're going to look at each of the individual boxes that make up this picture. And then a Gestalt psychologist would say they see a woman, because that's what all those tiny pictures of flowers actually create in the background. That's the whole when you put them all together. All right, now we get to some of the heavy hitters here with psychology. These are names that you've probably heard, at least the first one, and that you will hear many times in our class. So the first is Sigmund Freud. Freud is how you pronounce that last name. Sigmund Freud is one of the most famous psychologists. He's somewhat notorious because he had some very out there ideas that a lot of psychologists have sort of disproven over the years, but he still has made significant contributions to the field of psychology in his time, and he still influences psychology today. So he is most well known for founding the perspective of psychology known as psychodynamics. Psychodynamics focuses on the unconscious. So what's going on below the surface that we're not necessarily aware of, but is definitely going on in our minds. And his perspective is also sometimes called psychoanalysis. So when you see psycho at the beginning of the perspective, it's Freud, psychodynamics or psychoanalysis. And we're going to spend a lot more time on Freud later, so just file that in the back of your mind. And then another psychologist we'll talk about a little bit later in more detail is John B. Watson. John B. Watson is a behaviorist, and behaviorists focus on, surprise, surprise, behavior, specifically observable behavior. So they look at what can I see people doing. And they, in contrast to Freud's branch, they criticize psychodynamics because psychodynamics focus on what's going on under the surface. You can't put that into writing. You can't observe that directly. You have to hope that the person is telling you what's going on, but you don't know exactly what's going on in their mind. Whereas with behaviorism, you're looking at what can I physically see happening. They study mostly stimulus and response learning. So a stimulus, and then how does someone react to that stimulus? All right, two other behaviorists are Ivan Pavlov and B.F. Skinner. And there's a whole unit on these guys. So we'll get back to Pavlov, Skinner, and Watson in more detail. But just to give you a background, both behaviorists, Pavlov is the founder of classical conditioning. Skinner is considered the founder of operant conditioning. And you will learn what those are and how to contrast them later. Some of the major branches of psychology, we went over the first two. One was the behaviorist perspective, or behaviorism, and that includes psychologists like John B. Watson, B.F. Skinner, Ivan Pavlov. They focus on behavior. What can you observe people doing? Then you have Freudian psychology, which is also called psychodynamics or psychoanalysis. And they focus on unconscious thoughts and the emotional response to those things, especially with an emphasis on childhood. So what happens to us in our childhood and how that affects us later in life. And another really major branch of psychology is the humanistic perspective, or humanism. Now, you guys have taken world history. You learned about humanism a little bit. And the way I always teach my world history students about humanism is I say the easiest way to remember is, yay, humans. It's a very positive, I think, perspective, optimistic, idealistic. So looking at humans as having great potential and that we all want to reach our highest potential. So a humanist psychologist studies how we strive for our highest potential and how we might be limited by our environment and how that affects us psychologically. So some famous humanist psychologists are Carl Rogers and Abraham Maslow. And you may have heard of Maslow, especially if you're taking any classes about education, then you've heard of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And the highest peak of that pyramid of needs is to get to reaching our fullest potential, and that's called self-fulfillment or self-actualization. So basically, it's looking at how our current environment influences our potential to grow and our need for things like love and acceptance and self-esteem, etc. So you do not need to write this down. You don't need to remember this yet. We are going to come back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs much later in the year. All right, a new branch that developed later is called cognitive psychology. And when you hear the word cognitive or cognition, think about thinking, okay, the word thinking. So the cognitive revolution in the field of psychology, as far as history goes, is a time period where this came into the forefront of how we studied psychology. And it focuses on how our mind processes information and how it retains that information. So topics that fall under cognitive neuroscience include memory, perception, thinking, language. So anything that's conscious thinking within our brain is going to be part of cognition. Some famous cognitive psychologists are Harry Harlow, who we'll talk about later. He's famous for his study on what's known as the Harlow monkey experiment. And this is him over here. And then Jean Piaget. Again, my education people, you've probably heard of Jean Piaget because he studied children's cognitive development. So you're probably noticing that all of these guys we're going to hear about again. So don't freak out about trying to memorize all of these people right now. You're going to hear these names multiple times, and by the end of the year, some of them you're going to be like, oh, that, Sigmund Freud, yeah, we get it, okay? John B. Watson, yeah. All right, so it should be easier by the end of the year to remember all these guys and girls and what they're about. To break it down, review a little bit of what we've talked about. Psychology is the science of behavior and mental processes. So behavior being, examples of behavior being things like smiling, sweating, blinking, yelling, screaming. And then mental processes being our dreams, our thoughts, what we believe, our feelings, our emotions. So a behavior is just what we do, and then the mental process is what's going on internally, our subjective experience of the world. Okay, now we're going to look a little bit at our second module in the textbook, which is going to start going into those big approaches, the major issues that psychology focuses on, and how each different approach to psychological study looks at those big questions. The biggest question that psychologists seek to answer is the question of nature versus nurture. And you might have heard of this debate before. It's a heated debate, it's still going on, and there's no right or wrong answer to this debate. But let me break it down for you, explain it, and then you can start to think about what you might believe about nature versus nurture. So when we say nature here, we mean human nature. So nature here, we're talking about your genes, your hereditary factors. So that includes things like personality characteristics and physical appearance. So that's nature. And when you hear nature here, think genetics mostly. Okay, then nurture. What does it mean to nurture someone? It's this picture that you see here, this sweet little loving family. They're hugging on the baby. So nurture is more about the environment around us. So it includes things like the experiences we had as children, how we were raised by our parents, what kind of social relationships we have with people, friendships, romantic relationships, family relationships, and the culture that we grow up in. So nurture is about everything around us, outside of us, in our environment. Now, this is where it gets confusing, and every year I have students that struggle with this, so you're going to want to practice this. Nature is human nature, so genes, what you're born with, and nurture is what is around you as you grow up. Separate environment from the word nature in this class, because otherwise you're going to get very confused. And you'll notice these words are almost spelled the same. It's easy to, if you're writing an FRQ and you have funky handwriting, no shade to anyone, but if you have questionable handwriting, this is a point where you might actually get into some trouble because you might be asked to differentiate between nature and nurture, and you want to make sure that your handwriting is good so they can tell that you're talking about nature and not nurture, or vice versa. So take a second in your notes, and I want you to write in one sentence, what is nature versus nurture about? Okay, now in your notes, I want you to look at the T-chart that's in your notes, and you're going to sort all of these facts, these perspectives, into whether it fits on the nature argument side or the nurture argument side. So in other words, which has a bigger influence on who we are and who we become? Is it more about our genetics, nature, or is it more about the environment we grow up in, nurture? So read each of these, decide, and you can pause the video, decide where it falls in that T-chart, and then sort it for me. Okay. So now you had a chance to sort them, and here you can check yourself and see how you did. So first we have Plato, okay, famous Greek philosopher. Plato believed that character and intelligence were inherited and that we were born with certain ideas. That's definitely the nature side of the argument. Descartes, a French philosophe, believed that some ideas are innate. And if you don't know this vocab word, innate just means that you're born with it. Maybe she's born with it, right? Maybe it's Maybelline. So innate means it's inborn. It's something you're born with. So same as Plato here, right? So of course that's also nature. On the flip side, another Greek philosopher, Aristotle, said that nothing in the mind comes except from the external world through our senses. So he says that everything that makes us who we are comes from outside of us, and then it's influences what's going on inside. So he would fall on the nurture side of the argument. And also Locke, John Locke, who's another philosopher, he believed that when people were born, their mind was a blank slate. And this is something that you'll hear people call the tabula rasa. Tabula rasa just means blank slate. And so that means when you're born, you got nothing. And then everything that you experience and the world you grow up in then writes in who you are on that blank slate. So again, nurture. Okay, so now I want you to think about some of these questions that relate to this debate of nature or nurture, which has more of an influence on who we are. So each of these questions is something that kind of gets us thinking about whether we lean more on the nature side or the nurture side. So I want you to think about each of these questions. How would you answer them? And then figure out, does that mean that I believe that nature has a bigger influence or nurture? And remember, there's no right answer here. It's a debate. It's a debate that psychologists and scientists are still having today, and we still don't fully understand it. So this is why social scientists study twins, especially twins that are separated at birth. They're very interesting to study because though they share the same genetics, nature, they grow up in different environments, nurture. And so scientists love to look at that and try to figure out what things they have in common. Then they can pretty much say that those things they have in common, if they were raised in separate environments, are due to their genetics. And then any differences might be attributable to their different environments. Keep this in mind because at the end of the year, we'll watch a documentary that goes into that and looks at actually a set of triplets. When it comes to the big picture of psychology, all psychologists want to look at the mind and consciousness and behavior from multiple angles. And so there are three major levels of analysis that psychologists employ. We can look at it from a biological standpoint, a psychological standpoint, or a social cultural standpoint. And so together, all three of these levels create the approach called biopsychosocial. So biological influences, that's what we were just talking about with nature. That's your, genetic predisposition, what's going on in your brain and your body as far as chemistry, so brain chemistry, hormones, neurotransmitters, all of that. Psychologically, it's going to be things like your learned fears or learned expectations. It might be your emotional response to things, and it's going to be that all of the stuff going on in the brain that has to do with cognition, so processing information, perception, etc. And then social cultural is that nurture side. It's looking at how does the presence of others affect you in certain ways? How does the culture you grow up in affect you psychologically? Societal expectations, family expectations, peers, other groups, media, everything outside of you, how does that affect you as well? All right, and that is your first set of notes for AP Psychology. So I will see you guys on Zoom to practice identifying differences between the major approaches of psychology, and we're going to learn a tip on how to memorize some of this information that will help you on the AP exam. So I'll see you guys later. Bye.